For 20 years, Jacob Barnes had maintained his innocence from a death row cell. Now, he had only 90 days left to live. In the bleakest prison in Montana, where hope had turned to dust, a final, cruel joke was delivered to his cell. A 10-week-old German Shepherd puppy. This is the story of how that puppy began a desperate race against time to uncover a truth buried for 2 decades. It is a powerful journey, and we invite you to come along. If you believe in impossible odds, please like and share this video. And subscribe to Voice of Paws so you do not miss a single moment of this incredible tale. The number 90 had become the new architect of his world. It was the number of sunrises left to him, the number of stale meals, the number of nights he would lie awake listening to the lonely howl of the Montana wind as it whipped across the desolate plains surrounding Blackgate Penitentiary. For 20 years, Jacob Barnes had lived by the rhythm of appeals, of legal battles, of a desperate flickering hope. Now that hope was extinguished. The final appeal was denied. The date was set. 90 days. The words were a death sentence delivered long after the first one. Jake looked at his reflection in the small, polished steel mirror bolted to the wall. The man who stared back was a ghost shaped by 2 decades of concrete and steel. He was 51 years old, but his eyes held the weariness of a century. His once dark hair was a salt and pepper gray, thin at the crown. The lines around his eyes and mouth were not from laughter but from years of tension and disappointment. He was a man hollowed out, left with only a stubborn, bitter core of defiance, and the unyielding truth: he was innocent. The shriek of metal on metal announced the arrival of Sergeant Miller. Miller was a man built like a cinder block, with a thick neck and a face that seemed perpetually locked in a sneer of contempt. He had been a guard at Blackgate for as long as Jake had been a prisoner, and his dislike for Jake was a tangible thing, a cold pressure in the air whenever he was near. "Barnes, Warden wants to see you now," Miller grunted, his voice like gravel grinding together. The walk to the warden's office was a silent march down gray corridors that smelled of disinfectant and despair. Warden Thompson's office was an island of false civility in an ocean of punishment. A large wooden desk, a leather chair, a window that looked out onto the vast, empty expanse of snow-covered land. Warden Thompson was a man in his late 50s with a tidy suit and neat, combed hair. He looked more like an accountant than the keeper of 1,000 broken souls. "Sit down, Jacob," the warden said, gesturing to a hard plastic chair. Sergeant Miller remained standing by the door, arms crossed, a smug statue of authority. "We're launching a new initiative," Warden Thompson began, folding his hands on the desk. "A pilot program. We're calling it Second Chance Pups. Inmates on this block will be assigned a puppy to raise and train for future service work. It's a chance to contribute, to find purpose." Jake felt a cold, sharp laugh rising in his throat, but he choked it down. Purpose? His purpose now was to walk to a small room in 89 days and cease to exist. He stared at the warden, his silence a wall of defiance. "I'm not interested. It's not an invitation, Jacob. It's a mandatory assignment for this cell block," the warden said, his tone hardening slightly. "Your animal is already on its way." Sergeant Miller's lips curled into a faint smile. Jake could feel the man's satisfaction. Forcing a dying man to care for a puppy. It was a special kind of cruelty. A psychological torment designed to remind him of every normal human thing he had lost forever. When they returned to the cell, a small plastic crate sat just inside the door. Miller gave the crate a slight kick with his boot. "Enjoy your new cellmate, Barnes," he sneered, before slamming and locking the heavy steel door. The sound echoed, sealing Jake inside with the warden's sick joke. For a long moment, Jake just stood there, staring at the crate. He could hear a faint whining from within, a small, helpless sound that twisted something sharp in his gut. Finally, with a sigh that carried the weight of his entire life, he knelt and unlatched the door. A small, furry creature stumbled out. It was a German Shepherd puppy, perhaps 10 weeks old, with the classic black and tan markings of its breed. Its paws were comically large for its body, and its ears were still soft and floppy, giving it a look of permanent curiosity. The puppy blinked in the harsh light of the cell, then looked up at Jake with dark, intelligent eyes, full of nothing but pure, unfiltered life. It took a hesitant step forward and licked his hand. Jake flinched and pulled his hand back as if burned. He saw the soft fur, the trusting eyes, the innocent tilt of its head, and he felt an agony so profound it almost brought him to his knees. This creature was everything he was not. It was the beginning of a life, while he was the end of one. He turned away, unable to look at it, and pressed his forehead against the cold concrete wall. He named it Ranger in his mind, a silent, bitter tribute to the wild, free lands of Montana. He would never walk again. He ignored the puppy, a small, warm presence in the vast coldness of his cell. He would not let it in. He could not. But as the minutes ticked by, he became aware of a new sound, not a whine or a bark, but a soft, persistent scratching. He turned his head slowly. The puppy was not paying any attention to him. Instead, it was crouched by the far wall, its nose pressed against the floor, its tiny paws scratching methodically at a single discolored brick that sat just a fraction unevenly from the rest. For the first few days, the scratching was a maddening, persistent noise that grated on Jake's raw nerves. He would try to distract Ranger, pushing the small rubber ball toward him, but the puppy would inevitably return to the loose brick, sniffing and pawing with a singular, unwavering focus. But as days bled into a week, then 2, the sound became part of the rhythm of their shared existence. It was the backdrop to the slow, thawing process taking place inside Jake's chest. The countdown continued. 90 days became 80, then 70. But the numbers were now punctuated by the small, grounding realities of caring for another living being. Jake found himself talking to the dog, his voice a low rumble in the quiet cell. He didn't plan to. The words just started to spill out, fragments of a story he had held inside for 20 years. He spoke of the trial, of the evidence that was never found, of the real killer who walked free, while his own life withered away. Ranger would sit with his head cocked, his dark eyes fixed on Jake's face, offering a silent, unwavering attention that no human had given him in 2 decades. When the nightmares came, jolting Jake awake with a racing heart and the cold sweat of terror, Ranger would stir and nudge his hand with a wet nose, a small, warm anchor in the suffocating darkness. The puppy's presence did not erase the hopelessness, but it carved out a small space within it, a shelter where Jake could simply breathe. One night, long after the final head count and the lights had dimmed to a dull orange glow, Jake was pulled from a shallow sleep. It was not a nightmare that woke him, but a sound. It was different from the usual scratching. It was a sharp scrape of stone on concrete, followed by a soft, definitive thud. His eyes snapped open. In the dim light, he saw Ranger sitting proudly beside the wall, panting softly, his tail giving a triumphant wag, and next to him, on the cold floor, lay the dislodged brick. A current of adrenaline shot through Jake, sharp and electric. He swung his legs off the cot, his movements silent and cautious. He gently nudged the puppy aside, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knelt, his knees protesting on the hard floor, and peered into the dark cavity Ranger had revealed. It was a small, hand-carved hollow, dark with the grime of ages. Reaching in, his fingers brushed against something soft and bundled. It was cloth. With trembling hands, he drew it out. The fabric was old and stiff, a scrap from a prison uniform long since discarded. It was wrapped tightly around a small, hard object. He carried it to his cot, turning his back to the cell door, and carefully, with a reverence he hadn't felt in years, he began to unwrap it. Layer by layer, the filthy cloth fell away, revealing what was hidden inside. It was a silver cigarette lighter. It was tarnished and dented from its long confinement. But even in the dim light, he could see the elegant design, the mark of something expensive, something that had no place in Blackgate Penitentiary. He turned it over in his palm. His breath caught in his throat. There, on the smooth surface, were two initials, ornately engraved. C.W. Not J.B., not his. An image flashed in his mind, crisp and clear as the day it happened. The prosecutor, standing before the jury, holding up a crime scene photo. The victim's valuable silver lighter, a family heirloom, was missing from the scene. The prosecutor had boomed. Taken, we contend, by the defendant as a trophy. They never found it. Until now. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. The real killer, the man whose crime he was paying for with his life, had been here. In this very cell, he had hidden the proof of his guilt in the wall and walked away, leaving it to be buried by time. A wave of fierce, triumphant joy surged through him, so powerful it made him dizzy. He was saved. Here it was, the truth, solid and real, in the palm of his hand. But just as quickly as the hope flared, a chilling dread extinguished it. He clutched the lighter, his knuckles white. Who could he tell? The warden, who saw him as a number. A guard? Who would report it to Sergeant Miller? He could see Miller's cruel smile now, hear his mocking laugh as he took the lighter and made it disappear forever. They would say he planted it. They would say it was a desperate trick from a man with nothing to lose. The lighter was his salvation, but it was also a trap. He looked over at Ranger, who was now curled up asleep, his small body rising and falling with each peaceful breath. The little dog had dug up the past and given him back a reason to live, and in doing so, had placed a secret in his hands so dangerous it could be the very thing that killed him. The silver lighter became a hot, dangerous secret that lived in the palm of Jake's hand. He moved it constantly, from a hollowed-out book to a loose seam in his mattress. The fear of discovery a constant, metallic taste in his mouth. The days on the calendar fell away with agonizing speed. 70 days became 60, then 50. Each sunset was a stroke of a red pen through another day of his life. And the approach of his execution date was no longer an abstract concept, but a physical pressure building in his chest. Hope was a more terrible prison than despair had ever been. It made him frantic. His only potential link to the outside world, his 1 in a million chance, arrived in the form of a new lawyer. Her name was Anna Reed. He met her in the sterile visitation room, their conversation conducted through a thick pane of plexiglass covered in scratches. She was young, probably not even 30, with sharp, intelligent brown eyes and dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She was professional, her voice even, her questions precise, but Jake saw past the facade. He saw the weariness in her shoulders, the resignation in her gaze as she looked through his thick case file. To her, he was just another hopeless case, a pro bono assignment to be completed before moving on. He saw that she did not believe him, and in that moment he knew that just telling her about the lighter would be useless. He had to give her the proof. The opportunity came from a notice posted on the block's bulletin board. As part of the Second Chance Pups program, all the dogs were scheduled for a routine health checkup at a veterinary clinic in the nearby town. It was the first time Ranger would leave the prison grounds since his arrival. The idea sparked in Jake's mind. A plan so risky, so utterly dependent on chance, that it was either genius or madness. His eyes fell on Ranger's favorite toy, a tattered yellow tennis ball, scarred with the marks of the puppy's sharp teeth. That night, under the cover of a single dim security light, Jake went to work. Using a sliver of plastic he had sharpened from a broken utensil, he carefully cut a slit along one of the ball's white seams. With his fingers, he painstakingly hollowed out the inside, pulling out the rubbery core in small pieces until it was just a fragile, hollow shell. He wrapped the silver lighter in a small piece of cloth to stop it from rattling, pushed it inside the ball, and worked the seam closed. It was imperfect, but in the dim light of the cell, it looked like nothing more than a well-chewed toy. His weekly phone call was the next day. When he heard Anna Reed's polite, distant voice on the line, he spoke quickly, his words a desperate torrent. "Miss Reed, Anna, it is Jacob Barnes." "I do not have time to explain." "The vet clinic. Tomorrow morning at 10. Ranger, my dog, will be there. You have to meet him. Please." He paused, his throat tight. "My life is in my dog's toy. Please, you have to get it." There was a moment of silence on the other end, a crackle of static, and then her voice, no longer distant, but laced with confusion. "Mr. Barnes, what are you talking about?" The line went dead. His time was up. Sergeant Miller's suspicion grew with each passing day. He saw the nervous energy radiating from Jake, the way his eyes darted around, the obsessive way he played fetch with Ranger, and that specific tattered ball. Miller cornered him in the yard. "You look like a man with a secret, Barnes," he hissed. His eyes narrowed. "Getting awfully attached to that mutt. I hope you are not getting any stupid ideas." The morning of the vet visit, Jake's stomach was a knot of ice. As he was attaching the leash to Ranger's collar, the door to his cell clanged open. It was Sergeant Miller. "Surprise inspection?" he announced, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He entered the cell and began to tear it apart with methodical violence, tossing the thin mattress, upending the sparse collection of books. Jake stood frozen, his hand clenched on the leash, trying to will himself not to look at the yellow ball lying innocently on the floor. Miller's eyes landed on it. He walked over and picked it up, weighing it in his hand. He squeezed it. Jake's heart stopped. For a terrible second, he was sure the plan had failed. But the hollowed ball just gave way under Miller's grip. With a grunt of disgust, Miller sneered. "Pathetic." He threw the ball onto the cot. "Get the dog ready. It is time to go." A moment later, a different guard came to collect the puppy. Jake knelt, his hands shaking. He hugged Ranger tightly, burying his face in the puppy's soft fur. "Be a good boy," he whispered. He placed the tennis ball gently in Ranger's mouth. He watched as the guard led his dog, his last impossible hope, down the long gray corridor until they disappeared from sight. The world outside Jake's window had disappeared. Montana had been erased, replaced by a churning, violent vortex of white. The blizzard had descended without warning, a furious assault of wind and snow that howled like a hungry animal. Every gust that rattled the thick glass of his cell window felt like a nail being hammered into the coffin of his hope. Time was no longer his only enemy. Now, nature itself had conspired against him. The heavy tread of boots stopped at his door, and Jake knew it was Sergeant Miller before the man even spoke. The slot opened, and Miller's smug face appeared. "Looks like your trip is off, Barnes." He gloated, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "The roads are closed. God himself doesn't want your mutt leaving this prison. Guess it'll have to die in here with you." The slot slammed shut. The finality of it was a physical blow. Jake sank onto his cot, the last of his strength draining away. It was over. But then he looked at Ranger. The puppy, oblivious to the storm and the shattered hope, was watching him, head cocked with concern. In that moment, something inside Jake snapped. He would not let it end like this. He jumped up and began banging on the steel door with his fists, yelling for a guard, his voice raw with a panic he did not have to fake. When a guard finally came, Jake was wild-eyed. "It's the dog!" he gasped, pointing at Ranger. "He's having trouble breathing. He's choking on something." It was a desperate lie, but his terror was real. His performance was so convincing that minutes later he was standing before Warden Thompson, making a passionate, frantic plea for the life of his dog, arguing that a delay could be fatal. The warden, annoyed but unwilling to have a dead puppy on his hands, finally relented. The transport would proceed, as soon as a plow could clear a path for the van. At that same moment, miles away in her small, warm office, Anna Reed was staring into the same blizzard. Jake Barnes's desperate voice echoed in her head. "My life is in my dog's toy." It was the plea of a crazy man. A dying man. It made no sense. Every rational part of her brain told her to ignore it, to finish her paperwork and go home before the storm got worse. But she couldn't shake the raw, unscripted terror in his voice. It was different from the rehearsed claims of innocence she had heard so many times before. It was a splinter in her mind, a question that demanded an answer. With a frustrated sigh, she grabbed her coat. She did not know why, but she had to go. The drive was a nightmare. The wind shoved her small car across the icy road, and the snow was so thick that the world was reduced to the few feet illuminated by her headlights. It was a fool's errand, chasing a cryptic message from a convicted killer through a deadly storm. Yet, she pressed on, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, driven by a sliver of professional duty and a powerful, inexplicable hunch. She arrived at the veterinary clinic just as the dark green prison van was pulling away from the front door. She had missed them, but then she saw a guard leading a single German Shepherd puppy toward a side entrance. It was Ranger. She burst from her car and ran, her feet slipping on the snow. "Wait!" she called out, breathless. She intercepted the guard, flashing her legal identification. "I am Jacob Barnes's attorney. I need to see the dog. It is a matter of case security." The guard looked at her as if she were insane, but her desperation was compelling. He grudgingly allowed her a few moments inside. A young vet tech led her to a small examination room where Ranger was waiting, his tail wagging nervously. Anna's eyes immediately found the tattered yellow tennis ball on the floor. Her heart hammered in her chest. She knelt, pretending to pet the dog while her shaking fingers felt for the seam. She found it. Turning her back to the door, she worked her thumbnail into the slit and pried it open. Something small and heavy fell into her palm. It was the silver lighter. It was tarnished and cold, but it was undeniably real. She saw the initials, CW, and in that instant, 20 years of legal certainty, of files and testimonies and verdicts, shattered into a million pieces. Jake Barnes was telling the truth. The proof was right here, in her hand. A wave of nausea and adrenaline washed over her. She scrambled for her phone, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold it. No service. The screen was blank. She looked at the clinic's wall phone. The vet tech gave her a sympathetic look. "The lines are dead. The storm knocked out everything an hour ago." Anna stood frozen, the lighter clutched in her hand. The howling of the blizzard outside a terrifying echo of the impossible race that had just begun. Panic was afire in Anna Reed's veins, but beneath it was a core of cold, clear resolve. She clutched the silver lighter in her gloved hand, the small piece of metal feeling as heavy as a man's life. Leaving the warmth of the clinic, she plunged back into the fury of the storm. The drive to the county sheriff's office was short, but each second was an eternity. The wind and snow fought her, as if the world itself was trying to stop her, to let injustice run its course. She burst through the doors of the station, a wild figure bringing the blizzard in with her, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on the man in charge. Sheriff Brody was a man who looked like he had been carved from the Montana landscape. He was in his 60s, with a face full of deep lines, a thick gray mustache, and eyes that held a lifetime of skepticism. He was listening to a report over a crackling radio and looked up with annoyance as Anna approached his desk. She laid the tarnished lighter on a map of the county. "Sheriff, my name is Anna Reed. I am Jacob Barnes's attorney," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "His execution is scheduled for tomorrow. This was just recovered. It is the missing evidence from his trial." Brody picked up the lighter, turning it over with cynical curiosity. "Miss Reed, I have been a sheriff for 30 years. I know what desperate men on death row do. This is a prison trick, a stunt. Look at the initials," she pleaded, leaning forward. "CW, not JB. That lighter was reported stolen from the crime scene. A man is going to die. I am begging you. If there is a 1 in a million chance this is real, you have to make a call." For a long moment, the sheriff just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a weary sigh and handed the lighter to a young deputy. "Dust this. See if you can pull anything. Run it against Barnes's prints." The minutes that followed were the longest of Anna's life. Finally, the deputy returned, his face pale. "Sheriff," he said, his voice quiet. "It's faint, but there's a partial print on the side. It is not a match for Jacob Barnes." The room fell silent. The sheriff's skepticism finally broke, replaced by the grim seriousness of a lawman who knew he was standing on the edge of a terrible mistake. He reached for the satellite phone, the only working line to the outside world. The stay of execution came through with less than 3 hours to spare. It set off a frantic chain of events. The 2-decade-old case file for the murder was reopened. The initials CW, combined with old prison records, quickly led investigators to one man, Charles Wright, a former inmate who had occupied Jake's cell for 6 months on an assault charge and had been released shortly after Jake was convicted. They found him living quietly, 2 states away. Confronted with the silver lighter, the old man broke down completely, a lifetime of guilt pouring out in a flood of confession. Several weeks later, the immense iron gates of Blackgate Penitentiary slid open. Jacob Barnes walked out, not as a prisoner, but as a free man. He stopped, lifting his face to the sky, feeling the weak afternoon sun and the crisp Montana wind on his skin for the first time in 21 years. He was thinner, older, and the scars of his ordeal were etched deep into his soul. But the hollowness in his eyes was gone. Anna Reed was waiting for him by her car. He walked toward her, and for a moment, no words were needed. "Thank you," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. She simply nodded, her own eyes shining. "Where to, Jake?" He looked toward the rolling hills in the distance. "Take me to my dog," he said. At the Second Chance Pups facility, they led him to a large, grassy enclosure. And there he was. Ranger was no longer the clumsy, floppy-eared puppy Jake remembered. He was a magnificent young German shepherd, nearly fully grown, with a proud posture, intelligent eyes, and ears that stood at sharp attention. He was watching a bird in a tree, the picture of strength and confidence. Jake's heart ached. Would the dog even remember him? He called out his name, his voice catching. "Ranger!" The dog's head whipped around. He froze for a single, heart-stopping second. His body tensed. And then, a flicker of recognition dawned in his eyes. A low whine escaped his throat, followed by a bark, not of aggression, but of pure, unrestrained joy. He launched himself across the enclosure, a black and tan blur of speed and love, and leaped into Jake's open arms, knocking him back a step. Jake sank to his knees, hugging the dog that had saved his life, his tears finally flowing freely, soaking into Ranger's thick fur. The next morning, as the sun began to cast its first golden rays over the vast Montana landscape, a man and his dog stood together on a windy hill. Jake threw a stick, and Ranger bounded after it, his powerful form moving with the grace of a creature born to be free. Jake watched him, a deep sense of peace settling over him for the first time in his adult life. The long night was over. Here, with his loyal friend beside him, was the dawn. Their dawn. In the end, it was not a grand plan but a simple, unbreakable bond between a man and a dog that brought the truth to light. Their journey teaches us that loyalty speaks a language all its own, a silent promise that can conquer despair and rewrite our future. We are a community that cherishes these connections. Follow Voice of Paws to continue hearing the remarkable tales that animals have to tell.